Hello, my name is Ali Cherri, and I'm the artist in residence at the National Gallery.
Hello everyone, welcome to this very special edition of our Unexpected View talks. My name is Priyesh Mistry, I'm the Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery, and I'm really pleased that you have all joined us this evening to talk about Henri Rousseau's wonderful painting, Surprise from 1891, a work that I know for many has captured our imaginations from a very young age. So I'm very pleased that our artist, Ali Cherri, has chosen this work for this evening's discussion. As you know, the Unexpected View series is a series where we explore one of the National Gallery's paintings through the practice of a contemporary artist working today. Not only to think about the shared themes and ideas between those two practices and those two in those works, but also to think about how contemporary artists are working across the world and across the UK. Now, before I introduce Ali Cherri more formally, I'd like to thank Hiscox for supporting this evening as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner. Now, I mentioned that this evening is a very special edition of the Unexpected View talks, not only because of the wonderful painting that we're going to talk about, but also because Ali Cherri is the National Gallery's current artist in residence. So Ali is working in our on-site studio in the depths of the National Gallery for a year, and as part of this fantastic program that collaborates and partners with another museum and another collection outside of London. This year, we're really fortunate to be able to partner with the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum in Coventry, and Ali will be producing a whole new body of work in response to both of the collections. We'll be showing some of this work in the gallery in February next year, so do come back and see us then, and to see Ali's new work. So Ali Cherri makes films, sculptures and drawings within these installations that interrogate the relationship between ancient and natural worlds to the museums, galleries and contemporary society at large. And we will explore some of the ways in which he does this through our discussion this evening. Ali lives and works in Paris and Beirut, and his work was presented at recent significant exhibitions, including the Guangzhou Biennial in 2020, Manifesta 13 in Marseille also in 2020, and the Jamil Art Centre in Dubai in 2019. Ali was nominated for the Ebraj Group Art Prize in 2018 and is the recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation Award in 2017. So it's a huge honour for us to be working with Ali this year, and I'm delighted that he will be speaking with us today. So welcome, Ali.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. And I know as the artist in residence, it's always quite a daunting challenge to be faced with all the iconic works in the National Gallery's collection. So my first question is, how did you come to choose and select this work for our discussion this evening?
Well, it's a real delight actually to be able to spend time in the galleries and with all these paintings. I was of course drawn to this work. It's first the only Rousseau painting at the National Gallery, and of course it's one of the most iconic works. And the reason why I chose to talk about this is because under the naive impression of the work, it's a quite complex and intriguing painting.
And I think you're absolutely right, because there's so much in this that I think it talks about a lot of things around the way of looking, but also about this idea of what the imagination could be. Yeah. You know, we know that Rousseau, when he painted this work, actually never left Paris. Yeah. You know, there was a lot of kind of rumors around when he was producing these kind of works and first showing them. He just showed regularly at this annual exhibition called the Salles des Indépendants, and people were kind of quite divided about it. Yes. And as we can see, it's a really luscious kind of setting, but it's completely imagined. Yeah. A lot of the sources that Rousseau took was from his visits actually within Paris to the botanical gardens, the Jardin des Plantes, which also had a zoo, but they also had this collection of stuffed animals. Yes. And that's where he kind of learned a lot of his a lot about animals and about the plants.
Yeah.
Part of your work, which I think is really interesting, and also what's interesting in the way that it's drawn us to this painting, is that you also look to the natural world in an interesting way, and it's one of these paintings in the collection that has really looks at nature in this kind of imagined sense.
Yeah. I mean, what I find interesting about this work is that Rousseau is completely inscribed in his time. I mean, with the whole fascination with the exotic subject, with the savage and its relation to the modern subject. But what is quite radical, actually, and different from what other paintings of his time were doing, like Gauguin or Delacroix, is that his exotic subject is completely built in the artificial. As you mentioned, I mean, his tiger is modeled after a taxidermy tiger. The plants, there are house plants, but plants from the botanical garden. So the painting is quite, the reference to this exotic construct is completely imaginary. And this tendency not to try to create an illusion and not to place this image of a faraway natural place as being in representation, but totally an artifice. And at the same time, like through this artifice, he manages to create a very intense experience of wildlife.
And also bringing that with it, that idea of that space within the art world as well. Yeah. And I think this is something that's interesting about your work in the way that you look to archaeology or to nature, and really how museums, how galleries kind of construct our idea of nature and classify them in certain ways, but bringing that within the museum and what that kind of means. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about an earlier film that you've made, where you've really explored that idea of nature coming into the gallery. It's a film called Petrified.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the work was an installation and the film, so Fragments and Petrified. And part of the film was shot at a wildlife park. So I was interested in this whole idea of preservation and preservation of nature as the modern project of preservation, and how destruction is quite embedded within this project of preservation. I look at archaeology, like I work a lot with archaeological museum and with archaeologists, and looking at this whole idea of preserving the ruins from falling into ruin, and how this idea of ruin as not being a process of ruination, but like as an end to itself. And of course, I mean, capitalism have invented ruins as spectacle, and we know the whole economy that is built around, like touristic archaeological sites. So I was interested in the whole construct of nature being something that you go and we look at, and like really as a spectacle instead of it being an experience. So in Petrified, I make this parallel between the wildlife park and the archaeological site or archaeological museum.
So can we talk a little bit about what happens in the film, because it's an extraordinary work, where at the beginning you're looking at sort of, I guess, wildlife in the natural world, and then you transition. Yeah.
I mean, it's how we move these objects, or this, I mean, the natural from outside to become, like in a framed context or a boxed inside the space, and how there we could see how the ideology that's behind our ideology of what is nature, what is wild, what is the natural world, how these are all constructs.
And did you, and you also filmed within certain centres and certain museums and organisations, and there's this one fantastic scene at the end where you're filming within a museum that is a kind of constructed environment where you have living animals, birds, within that. I mean, that was an extraordinary scene.
Yeah, actually, like I produced a work from this, which is called Still Life, and it's actually shot inside the Gallery of Paleontology and Comparative Anatomy at the Natural History Museum in Paris. And what we see in it is actually a procession of all the species. And in front of this procession, there's a human, a male figure, a flayed male, muscular, standing on a pedestal with his arm raised in the air, leading the procession. And I think this image really summarizes, the whole Western knowledge, Western production of knowledge, and how the human is always placed, at the top of the hierarchy of the living. And I tried to counter this image with a sleeping figure on the bench, someone who's lying, with his arm pointing down, like resting, instead of being raised in the air. As a way proposing sort of a horizontal encounter with the species instead of the vertical male, dominant male that is presented in this scenography.
Yes, and that's a really amazing work, and there's one aspect of it, of the figure lying down, is one that I think reminds us that actually there's something very human about sleeping, and that's the element of human nature that returns us back to our being, as in our kind of, our natural being, that we can't surpass that. We all have to sleep at some stage, right?
Yes, and actually the sleeping figure is a reoccurring subject in my work. Like I use this in a video called Somniculus, which is Latin for light sleep. And I look at light sleep as opposed to regular sleep or deep sleep, where we say we fall asleep. We can imagine like a vertical descent. And I consider light sleep as the opposite, as being sort of a levitation. And it's a kind of receptivity to the world that doesn't go through the gaze. Like when you're in a light sleep, you still can hear the sound, smell, you can feel whatever is happening around you, but this receptivity doesn't go through the eyes. So I propose this kind of presence within historical objects, within a historical setup, as being part of this history, and not being the spectator who is looking at and setting meanings to this history.
Can you just describe what the camera is doing during that film Somniculus? Because you look at a range of objects. Yeah. But could you just describe the film? Yeah,
the film is shot in different museums and galleries in Paris. It's the Louvre, in Quai Branly, the Ethnographic Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Hunting Museum, and the Musée de l'Homme, the Man Museum. And it's actually we have again this figure of the guard, or of the guard that is in a way the only person allowed to doze off, to sleep in a gallery, like when you see someone sitting on a chair in a corner and his attention is sometimes somewhere else, but at the same time quite present. So I try to follow a procession, a route within these galleries, as if they are only one place, and with a torchlight try to put a light on these objects. They get lit by a different light than the museum light. It becomes like a light coming from a different source, and in a way awakening all these dormant objects.
And that's something that I think that can bring us back to Rousseau, in the way that he was also looking at a lot of these kind of taxidermied objects. So at the Jardin des Plantes, they had this fantastic collection of taxidermy, but almost kind of taxidermy, not just thinking about animals just as a still kind of object, but almost kind of animating them, sculpting them in these kind of quite fantastical scenes. Almost, as we were mentioning before, meeting that kind of demand of thinking about the primitive, the natural as this kind of exotic threat, or something that's kind of violent within nature. And that's something also kind of, I think, is really interesting in the way that these objects that Rousseau really looked at and sort of learnt from and kind of really reinterpreted for his paintings, also were sort of animated in their kind of sleep, you know, or in their death. There was sort of something in between.
What I find in taxidermy is actually, it's not immortalization of life, but actually it's the immortalization of death. And I think what Rousseau does here is exactly that. For me, what we're looking at is really a theater. I mean, you could see the lighting, the backdrop, the rain looks like a theater backdrop. I mean, you feel like there's two spaces. There's the back and there's the stage where this dead tiger, which is a taxidermy tiger. And we know, like from earlier title of the work, there was a tiger hunting a prey. So we could imagine there used to be a prey in earlier versions of the work that might have been hidden under these darkened leaves. So it is a moment of death that Rousseau is presenting to us. And this moment of death is captured like in this fraction of a second of the lighting, just like a camera flash that captures this moment of death. And I think putting this artificial nature as a moment of death, it's actually what makes this work quite interesting and complex.
But also, I think also the ambiguity around this. You know, I think when Rousseau was painting a lot of these kind of imagined sort of jungles, you know, there was a lot of rumor around them. You know, his work wasn't necessarily appreciated by the wider public. You know, it was kind of derided, but everyone enjoyed the kind of the spectacle of it. You know, even the earlier title alluded to a prey in this picture, but actually, I don't think there ever was one. And even the kind of title now, Surprised. You know, what are we kind of really referring to in this picture? Are we thinking about the prey and the prey being surprised? Are we surprised? Is it the tiger that's being surprised by the lightning, or us being surprised by the tiger? You know, there's all these kind of interesting sort of ambiguities, which I think also plays into that.
There's something quite photographic about this. I mean, this quite like very fraction of a moment that he captures, but at the same time, how he builds also his subject. I mean, what I think here, like what at the time, what this whole process of of othering of the exotic subject, what Rousseau does here is actually the othering of nature, where nature becomes something imaginative, and in a way plays this role also of placing the human subject as a spectator of nature and not being the extension of this nature.
Can I ask you about the way that you use taxidermy in your work? Because I know that a lot of your sculpture is in the way that you, it's a kind of form of assemblage where you bring elements from different kind of sources and put them together. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the way that Rousseau also collages from a lot of different sources in different places to kind of create this image, this kind of composite image, totally imagined and totally a step further in a way. And then and also consequently, as it kind of moved through the collections over the ages, and then now on our walls in a national museum at the National Gallery, you have also done this.
I mean, in these assemblage sculptures, what I do is get like fragments and objects that are broken, that have been in a way demoted in the value system of how we value these historical artifacts, that they lost any value because of them being fragmented. And by putting them back together, piecing them together, but also with objects or things coming from the natural world, like taxidermy, like stuffed animals, bird skins, and how the coming together of all these pieces can create sort of a resurrected life, but also this resurrected life come in the form of the monstrous, like in the monstrous as being also the other, as the mythical monster, which is everything that is not us, and how they're coming back to a certain life or a certain body is always through a process of othering.
So last year, you installed some of these objects, these assemblages and these sculptures within the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Marseille as part of Manifesta 13. Could you talk a little bit about that kind of intervention and what kind of response you felt, and the reactions you had in terms of, or you felt by placing these objects within this kind of setting?
I mean, so in this project, I placed 4 totems at the entrance of the Beaux-Arts Museum in Marseille, which is housed in the same building where there is the Natural History Museum. The two museums are facing each other, and actually when talking to the museum directors, they never collaborate, or there's really not any link between these two institutions. And I found this clear separation between these two worlds is physically happening within the Palais Longchamp, where the two museums are located. So what I wanted to do is place these totems, along the tradition of being something that welcomes the visitors, or also tells a history by this piecing together vertically a vertical history, and bringing in animals, taxidermy animals, from the Natural History Museum inside the Beaux-Arts Museum, and asking this question: do animals have to be dead to enter the Beaux-Arts Museum? Of course, in echo of the Gorilla Girls, do women have to be naked to enter the Met Museum? So it was this question of why these animals are never within the Fine Art Museum.
I think that also kind of helps us bring back to this idea of, at Rousseau's time, thinking about the primitive other, that kind of othering of nature. But this was going hand in hand with this growing fascination at that period of other cultures, of world cultures, and how we kind of come to understand them within the kind of Western society. Here, I think Rousseau was actually being a bit more kind of forward-thinking in a way, that he was sort of playing on that idea of the primitive. You know? So all of these kind of scenes, you can't necessarily reference them to precise kind of examples of fauna or botany. Instead, it seems like it's a fusion of many different kinds of plants all at once, or different kinds of animals in different ways. This isn't a kind of based on a real-life tiger. It's a fictive form. I think that idea of the imagination is something that I wanted to kind of explore with you in your work a little bit more as well. We touched on it a little bit more before when we were talking about this idea of the monster, the monsters of this, these creations that you kind of make. But also, I think that space of fiction within your work and what possibility that allows.
I look at the possibility of the imaginary as being a political tool. I think the space, that's imagined space of the forest, and with all that has been built around, the forest, that's where, like wild creatures could come out. That's where danger could be, especially forest at night, like as a space of danger, but also as a space of possibilities. And it's, I've worked with these themes also with the current work I'm doing, which is a feature film called The Dam, where one of the film sequence happens actually in a palm grove, at like a dreamlike sequence that's happening at night, and where the main character in a way gets his imagination restored in this magical space. But also for me, it was like a political commentary on a specific moment where the film was shot in Sudan during the revolution. So the project started before the revolution and ended after the fall of Omar al-Bashir regime, ending 30 years of dictatorship. And I was looking at the power of the imagination as a political strategy, as a political tool to change reality. You cannot change your world if you are unable to imagine a different life or a different world. And I think what these oppressive regime, what they do is actually they occupy or they colonize the imaginary in a way that you can think there is no other world or possibilities to live but under their rules. So in a way, the resistance or the political action is to take back the space of the imagination and use it as a strategy to conquer what the enemy has produced for us.
So thinking about kind of that idea of the imagination as this kind of political space, I think I want to ask you about your time during this residency so far. You know, we're working in our studio here on site, and you have the entire collection to kind of work with, but also the collection at the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum. So I wondered if you might be able to give a sort of teaser about the kinds of thoughts you're thinking about at this moment.
So what I'm really looking at is politics of visibility inside the institution, like what is allowed to be visible, and what is not, what becomes hidden, what becomes erased, and how these things can resurface again, and how can we make them visible and part of the dominant narrative.
And I think that's a really good moment just to look back at Rousseau. So thinking about how actually, if he had been making his work, you know, 2 or 3 decades earlier, actually this work might not have picked up. One thing that we didn't mention at the beginning was that Rousseau wasn't a trained painter. You know, he was self-taught. He was very much an outsider to the establishment. And it's only through the support of other artists around his time that he kind of grew in prominence and became sort of the artist that we all kind of admire and acknowledge today. But it was because of that kind of bold step in taking that kind of gesture to the imagination, you know, thinking about, well, what are these kind of fascinations with the exotic, and what can I really do with it, or Rousseau really do with this? And perhaps we can also think of that as a sort of small political gesture, you know, in a way of positioning himself as the outsider, trying to get the step in, and producing really quite imaginative, for me, quite ambiguous works, you know, that we get to look at and to enjoy today. So thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Priyesh.